Imagine a place where rivers speak, trees hold secrets, and power lay not only in strength, but in wisdom passed down from generation to generation. A land where kings and queens ruled with divine authority, but also with their hearts for the people. Now tell me, have you heard of the Luba kingdom? If you're curious, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these stories that school doesn't tell, and comment below, did you already know about this powerful kingdom in Central Africa? Well, our journey today begins in the heart of the African continent, more specifically in the region that is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There, around the 16th century, a grand and highly organized civilization emerged, the Luba kingdom. But what made this kingdom so special? First, its structure. The Luba kingdom wasn't a small village with a local chief. No. It was an empire with a complex organization, almost like a perfectly tuned machine. At the top of this structure was the Molopwe, the sacred king. But he didn't rule alone. There were advisors, priests, guardians of traditions, and as we'll see later, women played a fundamental role in power. Luba kingdom was made up of several villages that united under a common leadership, creating a political but also spiritual federation. They valued ancestry, connection with the gods, and the teachings passed down from their elders. It wasn't just a monarchy. It was a political system that blended the physical and spiritual worlds. Governing wasn't just about commanding, it was about protecting the cosmic order. Luba people were known for their refined art, their use of the lukisa, a kind of wooden book that stored their memories, and for a culture that withstood the test of time, even with all the difficulties that would come later with the invasions and European colonialism. And in this entire universe, one figure stood out. A woman. A leader. A feminine voice that echoed through the forests and rivers of the Congo, Queen Luba. But who was this woman? Where did her power come from? And how did she influence the fate of an entire kingdom? This is the story we are going to learn now. Now that you've seen the Luba kingdom, imagine this scene with me. The sun rises over the green forests of the Congo, and drums beat in the distance. It's not a day of war, nor a common celebration. It's a day of reverence. Because in that wooden palace carved with ancient symbols, a woman walks with a steady gaze, her bare feet touching the red earth, and everyone, men, women, children, even warriors, bows their heads before her. She is the Luba queen. But did she really exist as a single person? Here comes something very powerful. The name Queen Luba doesn't refer to just one woman, like a specific figure with a date of birth and death. It represents something greater, a symbol, a constant presence in the history of the Luba kingdom, personified by several women who ruled or influenced the fate of the people. Women who were much more than queen consorts. They were wise, warriors, spiritual leaders, and advisors to kings. Within the royal court, these women held positions of extreme importance. The king's mother, for example, was known as an Nkashi, and in many situations she was more feared and respected than the king himself. She guided political decisions, maintained balance between clans, and oversaw ancestral rituals. And here's a crucial detail: the Luba kingdom followed a matrilineal system. This means that, unlike many European kingdoms, power was not passed from father to son, but rather through the mother's line. In other words, the mother determined who was truly of royal blood. This meant that the women of the royal family played a central role in the succession and legitimacy of the throne. So, when we speak of Queen Luba, we're talking about all these powerful women, mothers of kings, village leaders, priestesses, and even regents. Some of them even ruled directly during times of transition, war, or political crisis. They didn't just occupy a place in the palace, they decided the course of the kingdom. And the strength of these queens didn't come solely from their title. It came from the respect a people had for their words, their wisdom, and the spiritual connection they maintained with the gods and ancestors. In a world where knowledge was sacred, Queen Luba was a living library, a bridge between the past and the present. Now get this. In the Luba kingdom, the king could have many sons, but none of them could assume the throne unless his mother was of royal blood. Yes, that's right. Power in the Luba kingdom, it didn't come from the father, it came from the mother. This system is called matrilineal lineage, and it completely changed the way power was passed down. Instead of a king choosing his firstborn to reign after him, the kingdom's eyes turned to the maternal line. It was as if the throne ran in the blood of women, and only the son of a woman of the sacred lineage could rule. And this had a huge impact on the political structure. The women of the Luba elite, especially those belonging to the royal clan, were not just the king's wives. They were the living keys to the empire's continuity. This made marriage a state strategy. Choosing whom a royal woman would marry could define the future of the kingdom. Now imagine the weight of this. A young Luba princess grew up, knowing that the son she would bear might one day become king. And not only that, she herself would become a powerful, respected, and often feared figure, because if the king died or there was a succession dispute, it was the heir's mother who often assumed the reins of power until the situation stabilized. She was the regent, the voice of experience and ancestry. But this doesn't mean men were discarded. Quite the opposite. The system was balanced so that men and women performed complementary roles. While kings handled wars, diplomacy, and the expansion of the kingdom, women ensured that the spiritual, cultural, and familial foundations were firmly in place. This model of power also generated stability. After all, instead of constant fighting between the sons of a king's multiple wives, as happened in so many other African and European kingdoms, the Luba kingdom used maternal lineage as a legitimate and sacred criteria. It was a way to maintain order and control the succession. But here comes a burning question. If women were so important, did they also rule? Were there queens who made political decisions, who faced enemies, who led as true sovereigns? We've reached a point in history that frankly should be discussed more in schools, books and films, female power in the Luba kingdom. And we're not talking about symbolic decorative power or a beautiful queen beside the king. Nothing like that. Here women held political, spiritual and social authority. They ruled, influenced decisions, led rituals and shaped the destiny of the kingdom. Remember that organized structure we mentioned at the beginning? Well, within that system there was room and respect for women's roles. They weren't just in the shadows of kings, they were pillars of the state. One of the most striking examples were the so-called royal mothers, who had an active voice in the councils of the throne. They advised the kings, their sons, grandsons or nephews, and in many cases their words carried the weight of law. When there were doubts, crises, disputes over territory, or even wars, the king turned to these women, who knew how to combine the strength of tradition with strategic intelligence. And you know what's most amazing? They were also spiritual leaders. In a society where connection with ancestors was fundamental, women played a vital role as intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Many were keepers of sacred secrets, healers, and responsible for fertility and land protection rituals. Some of these leaders were called queen mothers, or even village chiefs, with full authority over their territories, and in times of war or the king's absence, they assumed control, making high-level decisions. It was as if they had a key to the throne that could be used when the kingdom needed it most. All of this shows us that the Luba kingdom not only valued women, it depended on them. It depended on their wisdom, their lineage, their connection to the spiritual world, and their active presence in political decisions. And all of this was passed down from generation to generation. Women grew up hearing stories of their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. Real leaders with names and voices in history. This created a very strong sense of identity, where being a woman was not an obstacle, but a symbol of power, continuity, and respect. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without books, cell phones, or computers. How would you preserve your people's history? How would you remember who was king, who won a war, who betrayed the nation's trust, or who saved a clan from extinction? Luba Kingdom, this answer was clear. They created something so ingenious it seemed magical, the Lukasar. The Lukasar was a small wooden board, sometimes curved like a drop of water, covered in shells, beads, carvings, and colors. But make no mistake, it wasn't just a decoration. Every detail of the Lukasar was a key to memory, a tool for oral recording. It was like a living book, except you didn't read it with your eyes. You read it with your fingers and your soul. And who held this knowledge? In many cases, women. The women of the Luba Kingdom, especially those connected to the royal or spiritual lineage, were trained from an early age to read the Lukasa with touch, speech, and emotion. Each bead represented an event. Each engraved line, a battle. Each color, a clan, or an important transition on the throne. They memorized entire stories, passed down from generation to generation. It was as if each guardian woman was a walking library. And most impressively, they didn't just memorize the facts. They understood the meaning behind them. They knew what each political choice caused, what each blood union represented. They didn't just repeat stories, they interpreted the soul of the kingdom. These women were called members of the Mbudie Association, an elite group that guarded the kingdom's secret knowledge. They had access to mythical narratives, ancestral teachings, and the symbolic codes that sustained the power of the Molobwe king. With the Lukasar in hand, they led ceremonies, held councils, and even helped resolve political disputes. And look how interesting. While in the West, it was believed that power came from writing in books, in the Luba Kingdom, true power came from those who knew how to tell the right story, in the right way, at the right time. It was a culture where the word was as powerful as the sword. But all this sophistication wasn't just symbolic. It was also a practical way of maintaining the unity of a kingdom, with dozens of villages, tribes, and languages. The Lukasa was the invisible thread that connected it all. And, once again, women were at the center of this wisdom. Luba Kingdom. The world didn't end where the eye could see. For them, everything was connected. The rivers, the spirits, the ancestors, the kings, and of course the queens. Politics was done with the sword and the word, but true authority came from the unseen, from the spiritual world. And guess who was deeply connected to this invisible world? The women. Luba cosmology, female spiritual forces were creators, healers, and judges of fate. One of the most revered figures was Nkole, a goddess associated with fertility, water, and renewal. She was not only a symbol of life, but also of power, and queens were seen as her direct descendants or representatives on earth. During the kingdom's most important rituals, such as a king's coronation, royal funerals, or rain and fertility ceremonies, women led or conducted essential parts of the spiritual process. They knew the dances, the sacred chants, and the names of the ancestors to be invoked. It wasn't just religion, it was spiritual governance, and this was taken very seriously. A woman with spiritual wisdom could wield as much power as a military commander. Some queens combined both roles, political leader and spiritual mother of the people. They knew which plant healed, which river needed to be respected, which date was propitious for important decisions. Nothing was accidental. In villages farther from the throne, these women were also known as guardians of harmony. If a harvest failed, if a disease spread, the people looked to these female figures for answers, and they responded not with fear, but with authority and faith. This spiritual power of women was also a mechanism of resistance. When enemies threatened the kingdom, the people called not only on warriors, but also on invisible feminine forces. It was commonly said that before a battle, a queen mother or priestess spoke to the dead to protect the living. Impressive, right? But all this influence also generated respect and fear. After all, those who controlled the sacred could unbalance the world if they were crossed. And this respect meant that the queens were listened to with extreme attention within the court. Luba kingdom stood a powerful figure, the Molopwa, the sacred king. But the curious thing is that despite all the respect and authority he commanded, he never ruled alone. Beside him were women who weren't there just for appearances or protocol. They were part of the engine that kept the empire going, the royal consorts. And here's a detail that changes everything. In the Luba kingdom, a woman's position at the king's side was not just emotional, but also strategic and political. She was chosen based on her lineage, her wisdom, and often her spiritual role. In other words, she wasn't just the king's wife, she was a partner in government. These royal consorts, especially the so-called Great Wife, or Principal Wife, had direct access to the king and his circle of advisors. She often intervened in military, diplomatic, or administrative decisions. And if the king fell ill or died suddenly, it was this consort who maintained the stability of the court until a new king was chosen. But there was more. Some of these women came from other regions or important clans of the empire, and their marriages to the Molopwe served as political alliances, sealing peace agreements and strengthening the kingdom's internal ties. Thus, the king expanded his influence and secured the allegiance of diverse peoples all through these royal unions. And this required much more than beauty or etiquette. The consorts needed to be strategists, diplomats, and profound connoisseurs of Luba culture. They knew when to speak, when to remain silent, and most importantly, when to act behind the scenes to protect the kingdom. Within the palace, they also led religious ceremonies, family councils, and decisions about interclan marriages. And to top it all off, many of them were educators of future kings. Yes, they raised and educated their heirs, transmitting values, spiritual teachings, and the history of the people which, as we've seen, was sacred in the Luba kingdom. Therefore, in many historical moments, true power lay with the woman who whispered in the king's ear. If you think the royal consorts of the Luba kingdom spent their days in palaces, adorning themselves with jewels and flowers, forget that image. The reality was much more strategic and often dangerous. Queens weren't mere extras at court. They were experienced players on a board where the fate of the kingdom could change with a single word. Within the palace, they occupied a delicate position. They were mothers of princes, advisors to the king, spiritual leaders, and at the same time involved in a silent power struggle. It was an environment where alliances were formed behind the scenes. Decisions were made in the shadows of public meetings, and in many cases the stability of the kingdom depended on the diplomatic skills of these women. For example, when tensions arose between rival clans, the king would often send a consort, usually one with family ties to the parties involved, to mediate reconciliation. She went not only as the king's wife, but also as an ambassador for the throne, a bringer of peace. Queens also acted as protectors of the people. This may sound symbolic, but it was real. When the people suffered from famine, disasters, or injustice, they often turned to the Queen Mother or Great Wife. They served as a bridge between the people and the palace, and their voice within the court, when raised on behalf of the people, carried weight. Furthermore, many of these women commanded their own networks of influence. They had maids, advisors, allies outside the court, and even spies, all to stay informed and protect themselves, their families, and the kingdom itself. After all, in a court brimming with ambition, any oversight could be costly. And then there was the game of succession. With power passing through the maternal line, the struggle between consorts wasn't just emotional, it was political. The woman who managed to secure the throne for her son gained eternal status, and sometimes even more power than the heir himself. But what's most impressive is that despite this competitive environment, many queens managed to maintain the balance of the court for decades, using emotional intelligence, spiritual sensitivity, and a deep insight into the workings of power. And even outside the kingdom's capital, there were local queens, leading villages with wisdom. Women who knew how to listen, guide, negotiate, and if necessary, face a threat with courage. But all this elegance and strength, is also reflected in the art of the Luba kingdom. Sculptures, symbols, sacred objects, all reveal the place of women in the soul of the empire. Luba kingdom power wasn't just exercised, it was carved, painted, and revered in symbolic forms. And guess who consistently appeared at the center of this sacred art? The woman herself. Luba art is one of the most refined in Central Africa. Wooden sculptures, ceremonial scepters, royal stools, ritual spoons, all these objects carried more than beauty. They carried profound messages, and many of these messages revolved around women as guardians of both the visible and invisible worlds. Luba art is the so-called ceremonial seat, or royal throne. Rather than being simply a bench decorated with lions or shields, as in many kingdoms, the Luba throne was often carved in the form of a sated woman, her eyes closed in deep contemplation. She carried the king literally. The Molopui sat on the image of a woman, a symbol that his power was sustained by her. This woman represented the ancestor, the queen mother, the lineage, the spirit of the earth, the balance of the cosmos. It was a powerful image, the king at the top, but only because the woman held him up. Other sacred objects, such as the famous Lukasa memory tablets we mentioned earlier, also featured feminine references. Sculptures depicting women with large breasts, rounded bellies, or hands in a blessing position appeared as emblems of fertility, continuity, and protection. All of this was part of the aesthetics and ideology of the Luba kingdom. Women were not just social figures, they were the link between the past and the future. And the closed eyes in the female sculptures? They were a symbol too. It wasn't a sign of submission or blindness, but rather of inner vision, of deep wisdom, of someone who sees beyond what the eyes reveal. It was the spiritual, silent, all-understanding gaze. Luba art was also used to teach and guard secrets. In societies where knowledge was transmitted orally, the sculptures functioned as portals of wisdom. Those who knew how to read the symbols saw in the maps of the spiritual world, royal genealogies, and even political warnings. And this constant presence of the feminine in art was no accident. It was the people's way of saying, women are in everything, in birth, in death, on the throne, and in eternity. But not all was celebration. This powerful symbol began to be threatened when the Luba world clashed with the unknown, a new enemy arriving by ship with weapons, promises, and greed. And it is at this moment that some of these queens cease to be just sacred figures, to become living resistance against colonialism. Imagine an empire that for centuries operated with its own logic, its own kings, queens, rituals, and justice. A place where knowledge was stored in the body, in speech, in carved wood, where power was passed down through mothers and spirituality guided politics. Now imagine this world being interrupted, invaded, discredited by men who did not speak its language, did not respect its symbols, and saw wealth only in gold, ivory, and slaves. This is what happened when European colonizers arrived in the territory of the Luba kingdom at the end of the 19th century. And in this dark moment, many of the women who had previously ruled with wisdom and spirituality now had to fight with words, strategies, and in some cases direct resistance against a new kind of enemy. An enemy that didn't understand matrilineal logic, nor the spiritual value of female leadership. The Belgians, in particular, viewed African kingdoms as primitive and disorganized, and viewed queens with suspicion. They couldn't understand how a woman could wield so much authority, and worse still, they couldn't accept it. They tried to ignore them, delegitimize them, or use them as tools of control. But the queens did not remain silent. They saw their lands threatened, their children taken away, their rituals forbidden. And it was then that many rose up as symbols of resistance. Some acted as mediators, trying to negotiate with the colonizers to protect their villages. Others began organizing information networks, hiding places, and local resistance. In some cases, they even instructed warriors, guided escapes, and kept alive the memory of the times before the invasion. It was an unequal struggle, spears against rifles, ancestral wisdom against blind ambition. But the presence of these women was essential to ensuring that the soul of the Luba people was not completely erased. Even under occupation, they continued to tell stories, guard the Lukasa, and teach children about the ancient kings, queens, and gods. They planted resilience in their hearts, knowing that one day that knowledge would blossom again. And it was thanks to them that this story can still be told today. Because, even when publicly silenced, these queens never stopped whispering the truth within their families, villages, and tradition. When colonizers arrived, they brought pens, paper, and books. But with this also came erasure. Many African kingdoms that lacked written records were called historyless, as if the absence of paper meant the absence of memory. But in the Luba kingdom, history didn't live in books. It lived in people. What kept the memory of queens, consorts, and royal mothers alive were not documents but voices. Voices that narrated, repeated, protected, and taught with their hearts. Women once again, women were the great guardians of this legacy. Sitting around the fire, they told their children and grandchildren the stories of those who came before, strong women who ruled, who advised kings, who faced the colonizers with dignity and wisdom. And look, these weren't just heroic stories. There was drama, sacrifice, doubt, strategy. They were stories with soul. This is how the figure of Queen Luba has survived, even without a fixed name. Even though her face has never been painted in portraits, she lives on as a collective symbol of all the women who carried the kingdom on their backs, in their speech, and in their wombs. She is mother, grandmother, ancestor, goddess, warrior, and educator, all rolled into one. This oral legacy wasn't just a way to preserve the past. It was a form of silent resistance. When colonizers banned rituals and erased names, these women passed the story on by word of mouth, like a precious secret. And so, generation after generation, Queen Luba was reborn in the people's imagination. Luba communities in the Congo, you can hear stories about her. Stories that aren't in museums or school books, but that are etched in the eyes of those who heard it from their grandmother, who heard it at their great-grandmother, who heard it from someone who lived under that What's more, many contemporary artists, poets, and historians are turning to these oral histories to reconstruct what was lost. They're realizing that memory doesn't need paper to be eternal. But like every great story, not everything was rosy. The Luba kingdom also experienced dark times, with internal conflicts, betrayals, and disputes that tragically marked the lives of some of these queens. Because, yes, even within palaces built of wisdom, there is pain, intrigue, and sacrifice. So far, we've seen how the queens of the Luba kingdom were symbols of wisdom, spirituality, and leadership. But now it's time to look at the other side of the crown, because where there's power, there's also risk. And in the heart of the palace, not all was peaceful, not all alliances lasted. Luba kingdom, politics was conducted with elegance, but also with tension. There were silent disputes between families, clans, and lineages. Remember matrilineal succession? Well, it was powerful, but it also fueled rivalries. Each royal consort dreamed that her son would be the next king, and with this came intrigue, secret alliances, and even poisonings. Many oral histories preserved for generations tell of queens who were betrayed by their own families or who saw their children passed over in the line of succession. Some, faced with this, fought to the end. Others were silenced within their own court. There are stories of queens who trusted the wrong advisors and ended up in exile. There are oral histories of women who, trying to protect their children or territories, were accused of conspiracy and sacrificed in political rituals. And betrayal didn't always come from outside. Sometimes it came from within the heart of the court itself. Sisters who became rivals, nieces who plotted against their aunts, advisors who planted doubts in the king's ear. These tragedies, though painful, reveal the complexity of female power within the Luba kingdom. They show that these women were not unattainable legends. They were human. They loved, suffered, feared, and often paid the price for others' ambition with their own lives. And that's precisely what makes them so fascinating. They resisted. Even when betrayed, they didn't lose their dignity. Even when wounded, they held their heads high. Many died in silence, but they left deep marks on the people's memory. And no matter how much official history tried to erase their pain, the people never forgot. Because every tragedy, every betrayal, every injustice was told in whispers, in tears, in songs, in dawn cries, and all of this became part of the soul of the Luba people. But even in the face of pain, the figure of women never ceased to be seen as a symbol of continuity. And that's what we'll discuss next. How women, even in the darkest times, were still seen as guardians of life and the future. If the throne of the Luba kingdom was sustained by wisdom, the heart of this empire was sustained by something even deeper: the female womb. In Luba thought, woman was more than a human being. She was a cycle. She was the earth that generates, time that renews itself, the river that always flows again. It is no coincidence that in practically all royal sculptures, women appear with their bellies protruding, their hands on their abdomens, or their breasts exposed. These images were not merely visual. They spoke. They said, "This is where the world continues." For the Luba, the kingdom's continuity depended not only on victory in war, cunning in alliances, it depended on women. It was through them that the royal blood flowed. It was in their bodies that the future grew. It was with their guidance that new kings were formed. And it was in their wisdom that the elders trusted to maintain the balance of the clans. This idea went beyond the biological. Women were also considered guardians of memory, tradition, and justice. When a Luba woman spoke, she didn't speak just for herself. She spoke for all who came before. It was as if entire generations echoed within her voice. Therefore, to contradict a wise woman or a queen mother was for many the same as breaking with one's ancestors. In the villages, in ceremonies, in council decisions, respect for the female figure was almost sacred. She was seen as fire and root, the strength that protects and the foundation that sustains. It's no wonder that even when the kingdom began to crumble under the weight of colonization, it was women who carried the culture on their shoulders. While the men went off to fight, many women kept the village afloat, teaching, healing, caring, singing. And even today, centuries later, in many Congolese communities and among the descendants of the Luba people, the most respected voice is still often that of the grandmother, because she carries the memory, because she symbolizes continuity. But like everything that has a beginning, the Luba kingdom also met its end. Colonial invasion, internal imbalance, foreign pressure, all contributed to the collapse of an empire that had lasted centuries, but was all lost. No, because the Luba spirit and the role of women within it never disappeared. They just changed form. Every empire, no matter how strong, eventually faces the weight of time, and the Luba kingdom was no exception. However refined its political structure, profound its symbols, and ancestral wisdom its people possessed, the 19th century brought a storm for which not even the most ancient were prepared: European colonialism. The arrival of the Belgians in Congo changed everything. They didn't come to dialogue, they came to exploit, to seize wealth, control territories, and dominate peoples who, to them, seemed savage. The Luba kingdom, with its spirituality, oral transmission, and matrilineal system, simply didn't fit into the colonizers' logic. They wanted documents, maps, property records, a king who would bow, but the Mulapwe wouldn't bow, and neither would the queen. It was in this scenario that many women of the court became the last lines of defense of culture. Luba, with their kingdoms fragmented, their men persecuted or killed, many of these women took on a role that went beyond politics. They became symbols of cultural resistance. Some were persecuted, imprisoned, and forced to abandon their palaces and flee into the forests. Others disguised themselves as midwives, healers, or ordinary mothers, but they continued to pass on the ancient teachings, preserving the rituals and history in secret. It was a silent but powerful resistance. There are oral records of women who hid sacred objects from the colonizers, lukasa, scepters, sculptures, by burying them or hiding them in caves. Other accounts tell of mothers who made their sons swear, even under threat of death, that they would never forget the names of their ancestors. These women knew that the physical empire could fall, but that memory, if well protected, survives forever. And so, even when the colonizers officially dissolved the Luba kingdom and imposed their own laws, the spirit of the empire did not disappear. It survived in the songs, the proverbs, the hidden dances, the stories told at night. Women were the bridges between what the empire was and what it would continue to be in the soul of the people. And today, with the rediscovery of African history, many are looking back and saying, they were not defeated. They were roots that waited for the right time to blossom again. But what remains of all this? How does the figure of Queen Luba resurface in modern times? How does her legacy inspire black women, leaders, artists, and scholars in today's world? The empire may have fallen. The crowns have been removed, the palaces dismantled, and the sacred symbols hidden or looted. But even so, Queen Luba lives, not with a crown on her head or seated on a carved throne, but alive in the bodies, voices, hands, and art of African and Afro-descendant women around the world. She has resurfaced as a symbol, as a memory, as an unquenchable flame. Today, the figure of Queen Luba is vindicated as an icon of black female resistance and strength. In countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, artists are resculpting her forms in wood and bronze. Poets write about her powerful silence. Researchers trace her footprints in colonial archives and oral traditions. African and diaspora, feminist activists are inspired by her leadership to demand space, autonomy, and respect. And it's not just in Africa. In Brazil, the Americas, and Europe, many black women look to the history of the Luba kingdom and see a powerful mirror. They see that their bodies, so violated over the centuries, also carry royalty, wisdom, and the same kind of quiet strength that sustained an empire for centuries. In classrooms, in religious centers, in conversation circles, and on theater stages, Queen Luba is being retold, redesigned and reinterpreted. Not to be romanticized, but to remind the world that black women have always been at the center of history, even when books tried to erase them. More than a name, she became a symbol of ancestry, of matrilineal power, of forgotten wisdom, of the inner throne. And by reclaiming her story, we're not just looking to the past, we're rewriting the present with the words that were stolen from us. We're remembering that the throne, sometimes, isn't high up in a palace, but within the voice of a woman who refuses to be silenced. So, if this story touched you, if you, like me, get emotional thinking about everything that was lost, but also about everything that is coming back, leave your like, share this video, and comment below. What did you think of Queen Luba? Had you heard of her before? And most importantly, what other stories do you want to know? Because there are many more queens hidden throughout history, and we'll bring them to light, one by one. Queen Luba didn't disappear, she was just waiting for someone, like you, to listen to her again.